Hey.
Hi, hello, MG. Is that you?
Yep.
Yeah,
Afternoon, morning.
afternoon. Still don't have a camera here, so sorry.
All good.
Hello, Qiu Jin. Jian Chu.
Hello, good morning, good evening.
Oh, are we going to wait another minute?
Yeah, I think so. Let's see. Yeah, let's give it one more minute. All right, let's get started then. Welcome everybody to the June 19th SIG multi-cluster call, and the topic on the agenda is Honkai's discussion about the survey results from the Karamada community. Do you want to share your screen?
Okay. Sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Today I'm going to share a survey from Kamada community. So let's get started. So the background of the survey is about creating open PR at the community to okay. The PR are trying to define a standard concept in Sigma cluster. Though I thought this might be bring some impacts on Kamada users. So I started a survey in Kamada community. So that's it. And so um, so this survey is all about to understand the potential impacts on Kamada adopters. So especially for those using Kamada building like public service. So the survey, the key questions including three questions. First is the one in the PR. Which term do you prefer for cluster where Kamada is installed? So I list the options here, and I think let's include all the options we have talked about. And then the next question is for the concept of the cluster, which is managed by Kamada. Memo cluster, spoke cluster, workload cluster, and a managed cluster. Another question is most I want to get from the survey is the if the Kamada community going to change the concept, if it will bring some impact on our users. So the question is if renaming affects usage. So we totally get 20 responses. So the 20 is all from the 20 adopters, not the developers. And the 10 response from the GitHub and 10 from the form. Also list the form data at the end of the slides. Okay, first question, we can see most people in Kamada prefer to host the cluster. And the second, for the cluster, which is managed by Kamada, most people prefer the member cluster. And there are 4 adopters mentioned that if Kamada change the concept, they will need to change the documentation in their product. So, but the impact is minor. So, summary is Kamada user prefer the existing concept, but note that this since this survey is done in Kamada community, so people probably most prefer to the concepts Kamada is using right now. So another thing I get from survey is the changing concept will slightly affect some users, but they are open to change. So that's the survey. And any questions so far?
Well, seems clear to me. It's not from my side.
So, sorry.
I was just saying is the presentation is clear to me, so no questions.
Okay.
On my end.
So, also I think how to move this forward. I list some suggestions from me. I think so. In the previous PR, we are trying to define a single concept for the cluster. We are running the multi-cluster components. So I think we might be build a list of concepts rather than each time we start a PR to define just one concept. And also, I have mentioned my opinion on that PR is I think the SIG multi-cluster already build the concept in the previous project as we codified. And these concepts are still be using in the ecosystem, including the open source projects and the the users. As far as I know, some components in China. I know some components in China are still using Kubernetes right now. That's the truth. So so I so in my opinion, we can carry the previous concept in SIG Multicluster and to I think we can build the concept based on the concept that we made in this SIG. And anyone want to change it, I think we are open to change it. Yeah, that's all.
Right. So did Federation and KubeFed use host cluster?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I can show you. Sorry, I can link. I can write a link to. Yeah.
Yeah. KubeFed concepts.
Yeah, I think what we need is something like this concepts. Maybe for now, I think what we need is the host cluster, memory cluster, and then we can add more concepts on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess to summarize, there are a number of points. The first one is just the formalism of the documentation, having a single list of concepts. Maybe would it make sense to have the short list of concepts in a similar style to what you're showing there, the KubeFed concepts, with links to the more detailed documents, or do you think it would be better in a single document?
I
Having all
think
the
we.
detail.
I don't think we need to explain too much on each of the concept. I think something like this would be fine. Because what we need, what the ecosystem or the user needs is a definition of each concept. So
Yeah, so that's why I think maybe we need both. Well, both. There's a sort of a short glossary like this so that people
yeah,
reading the multi-cluster documentation know what they're talking about, and we can ensure that there's consistent terminology. Whether we end up, so that's one concern. Whether we end up talking about host clusters or hub clusters, that's something different. But that's one thing. But then the Corenton's PR added a bit more than that. There was also there's also the whole well, in the definition section, there are all the musts and mays and shoulds and so on that clarify what the expectations are in a bit more detail compared to just a glossary entry. And in particular, I think it's interesting to have the connection to cluster profile. But yeah, so I agree it would make sense to have a short glossary so that people can quickly get an idea of what we're talking about, and then maybe more detailed documents with all the interconnections. And it could be a single document or multiple. I don't know whether there's a particular advantage to one or the other. It might make, well, ideally the document shouldn't change very often, so there shouldn't be multiple PRs in progress against different sections of the document, I would hope. Does that make sense? Well, I mean, at least the idea of having a glossary plus more detailed content.
Yeah, what I understand is that we can have a short list of a glossary, and we still can have a more detailed documentation for the concept in some maybe somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just taking some notes. Then in your survey, and as I appreciate the selection of questions. So it's apparent that people aren't reluctant to change necessarily, but they obviously have a strong preference for a host cluster. And as you say, because they're Karmada users, that's not particularly surprising. In the same way, I expect if you asked OCM users, they would feel familiar with hub cluster. So do you think it's, well, are you strongly attached to the term host cluster, or is it more, are you okay with saying that it's important that we all agree on a term?
I personally, I would more prefer to host the class and the member cluster. So
yeah,
since I use these concepts about 5 or 6 years ago when I was started to contribute to Kubernetes project.
Yeah, I can understand that. So my concern, so I like I have concerns with both sets of terminologies. On the hub and spoke side of things, I think it's a bit of a shame because it's describing an architecture, and I think there's scope for other approaches maybe in MCS, although obviously currently the API fairly strongly assumes whether it's called a host cluster or a hub cluster, a special cluster, at least for the cluster that stores the cluster profiles and serves as the synchronization point. But I also think, so I would like to explore perhaps more peer-to-peer models, which would be less hub and spoke. So choosing the hub and spoke terminology is a bit limiting in that way. What I don't like really about the host and member cluster. So member cluster, I think that sort of makes sense to me because the cluster is a member of the cluster set. But having the host cluster, and so this is where I think the context is important. You showed the list of kubefed concepts, and so if you're describing things in a kubefed context or a Karmada context, then talking about the host cluster as being the cluster that hosts kubefed or Karmada, it makes sense in that context. But if you just talk about some more in a broader MCS context, what's the host cluster for a cluster set? And I'm not sure there's really a place that's to users who are not necessarily familiar with the implementation. Users who are just trying to use, so users who end up creating like service exports and seeing the result of service imports, for example, they won't necessarily know what the host cluster is. And they would perhaps think of host clusters. Well, what would be important for them to host is their actual applications. And so that's the exact opposite of the definition, because the host cluster, when you combine the kubefed definitions plus some of the recommendations in 8.2.10, where we say that the host or hub cluster shouldn't be used to host workloads, then the host cluster is actually a non-host as far as the end user is concerned. So yeah, so really, ultimately, what I'm saying is that host cluster, I think, makes sense as a term in the kubefed and Karmada context. I'm not so sure it makes sense for all users.
I see. I understand the host cluster and the control plane are different concepts. The host cluster just used to refer to the cluster where running the control plane components.
Yeah.
And the control plane means the including all of the multi-cluster components. And so for the example you mentioned, the MCS API, I think the MCS API should be in the control plane. If there is a MCS controller, the controller is running on host cluster.
Well, so that's the thing, right? You can actually implement, and this is what Submariner does, you can implement MCS without actually having anything running on the hub cluster. And when an end user, so it's different from the admin side of things, but if you look at it from the perspective of the end user, the multi-cluster API that they're interacting with is present in every single cluster, because they can create a service. The only thing that they interact with in most cases is service export, and they can create that. Well, they have to create it in the workload cluster that's actually hosting their service, the service that they want to export. So they never interact with the API, the control plane API. And the control plane API is only used by multi-cluster components in every single cluster. So see, that's where, I mean, it's a bit, well, not necessarily confusing, but it's strongly context dependent. And so if we're trying to write this as a common glossary so that both not just both, but so the implementers and administrators and end users can easily understand what the documents are explaining, then I think it's not the best choice of terms, maybe. Chujin?
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I agree with you, Stefan. So for the host cluster, I don't think that they need it for MCS API, and it's bring a assumption that there will be a control plane that running a cluster that is like a centralized cluster. It might apply to API for the cluster profile. Because if you have the cluster profile, you might need a cluster that hosting those API.
Yeah.
But might not be applied to like the SIG. So that's not quite clear to me whether maybe it's just applied to the. We might only should have that concept in the cluster profile instead of this.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. That's perhaps a clearer definition.
So the idea is I always I'm ever thinking is that the SIG should get the feedback from the open source projects currently working in the SIG Multicluster, and I know the OCM project are using the different concepts between Kamada, so that's the thing. So how about that? Are we going to list all the options again and list the each and list all the reasons why we prefer to particular concept and what's the concern there, and run another survey on the SIG in the SIG.
Yeah, well, I can suggest that. I'd have to go and look at the previous survey.
Yeah. Speaking of the previous survey, I feel sorry that I didn't
Yeah,
know
you missed it.
that I missed that, and I also let me see if I can easily find it. It's in the
Yeah,
one
it's
of
in here
the
somewhere.
yeah, it is somewhere. Sure. Yeah, here. So the host cluster isn't in the list. So, and this is the one thing I found. The host cluster is not on the list. And another thing is the people who run the vote. I think most of them are the developers, I think. Should we get more projects involved?
Yeah, in a more formal way, perhaps similar to what you did for Karmada, or there's another PR where we're asking.
Yeah.
For each individual. Let me just find it. Each, well, it's individual implementer projects feedback. It is, I think it's one of Arthur's PRs. All right, yeah, it was to the impact of moving service import spec fields. So that's, yeah, there's something we're doing elsewhere.
Yeah. So Stefan, I think we might also like this one. Maybe for this PR, another option is instead of putting into the community repo, whether it's more appropriate for the cluster profile AP repo, similar as what KubeFat does. It doesn't have a for KubeFat, it doesn't have the concept that has been built in the SIG in the community repo, saying this is the concept of the KubeFat that is in the KubeFat repo. Another option is we probably should, instead of putting this concept here, just put that in the cluster profile repo, because that is more related to the context of the cluster profile. It doesn't quite, for example, doesn't relate to the about API. It doesn't relate to MCS API.
So Julian, are you suggesting to make the definition or terminology, the glossary in cluster inventory repo?
Yes, I think that is more context related. Like under the context of the cluster inventory, you will have some concept of whatever management cluster, hub cluster, host cluster. But in the context of MCS and about API, you will not need that.
Yeah, I maybe have a different opinion. Mike just see me with another. Sorry, here. So I think the concept will be used everyone in the ecosystem. So here is the Argo CD. They also confusing with the mix used concepts. So I think the SIG multicluster should be the standard organization or team or group or something. They should make the standard in the very public place, I think.
Yeah, I think it's broader than cluster profile because if you look at even just the MCS cap, it would also it also uses similar concepts. So I think saying that it's the 8210 says this as well, but saying that it's the API, it's the place where cluster profile is hosted makes sense in terms of defining it. I don't think it limits it to cluster profile as a result of that, because cluster profile is intended to have an impact on lots of other things. So I do think it would make sense to have it be a common SIG-MC terminology document rather than just a cluster profile.
Yeah.
But
we also have a website, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we can put the content there.
Yeah. Yes. Ultimately, I think it should be there. Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense in the community repo, but it should also be on the website. But I think that's actually an interesting angle to look at it, though. Having a look at the existing caps to see which of them would have to be updated depending on the choice that's made for in terms of and which of them could probably be clarified as well once we have a common set of terms. But so I'll add a note to myself to do that. Right, so if we get back to the really the question that started all this, so I don't think either host cluster or hub cluster are great terms. I don't really have any idea right now of how better to call it. I mean, we could say the cluster profile host, but that's tying it to implementation details, and it's not really meaningful to most people. But yeah, so what I wanted to say too initially was there's the having a common set of terms at the SIG level is useful for people to read. Well, it only sets a requirement for SIG documentation, but from my perspective, more at the KET level. So even, well, ideally then projects that are hosted by the SIG would align, but I do think individual projects can still have their own terminology, because in many cases things won't quite align anyway. There's no, because the SIG publishes fairly high level specs that are intended for end users, describing things like service export, service imports, but leaving quite a lot, well, looking at the MTS API at least, leaving quite a lot of the magic to some sort of multi-cluster controller that's not strictly defined. There always will be a need for better defined terms in each project to describe exactly how they implement things. And for, thinking, for example, about OCM, regardless of what the SIG terminology is for the API, the cluster hosting the cluster profile API, the hub and spoke structure still is a strong assumption in OCM, and so that won't change. And so their hub cluster and spoke cluster makes sense, and that will be how OCM administrators probably will continue to think about things. So that's sort of, well, ultimately what I'm saying is really that there's a sort of additional level of interaction, and we can probably expect the SIG to have a glossary, but then projects that are trying to relate to the SIG docs would probably have a glossary of their own that says, well, here's how these concepts in SIG multicluster map to the concepts in this project. And it could be different from one project to another. I mean, even looking at, there are pointers, for example, to Istio terminology there, which is where the control plane, data plane meanings come from, as they're understood typically in this sort of discussion. And they have, well, in Istio, you can have as many control planes as you want for as many data planes as you want in theory. So there's not an actual mapping from you can't just talk about a control plane cluster. Well, at least not about the control plane cluster, because there might be more than one. So there's some additional mental gymnastics involved, because there's not a one-to-one mapping. And if we end up with more peer-to-peer structures, or even leader election, so that the host cluster can move around, that would sort of require additional terminology, and it doesn't really quite map anymore to a single host or hub cluster. But anyway, yeah, I think maybe we need to reframe the discussion a bit more, because there are two valuable pieces to the document. I think there's the documentation of all the expectations, and then there's the choice of names. And as MJ pointed out in the chat there, it's one of the difficult problems in computer science and IT in general, with a lot of bike shedding. So. Yeah, and then ultimately, if we run a survey again, maybe it'll be host cluster that wins this time. Maybe it'll be hub cluster. Maybe it'll be something else.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it doesn't come across either as being dismissive of the Karmada community or any other community. It's just trying to get a term that's not necessarily tied to implementation details and is meaningful to implementers and administrators and end users that are interested in this stuff.
Yeah, naming is pretty hard.
Yeah.
So if you are open to do another survey, so I can talk to Quentin and I can help with him, and maybe we can deliver a formal survey form.
Yeah, rather than just voting on GitHub comments in
Yes.
a PR that might not be all that. I can't remember if
Yeah.
this was I think it was mentioned in the mailing list, right? At some point. I'm just going to check.
Yeah, I think one.
Yeah, central cluster.
So maybe there's something that has been misunderstood in this PR that the SIG is trying to constrain, like, to set the control name must be, let's say, hub or host cluster, but in fact, maybe in this document it should be stated that it's not. I don't know. It's just it's not to be must for each project to be naming like that.
Yeah, it's
That's sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Quentin also mentioned that also asked the same similar question to me, that I think the reason why we need to build a standard concept in the SIG, the purpose of this is that we are trying to we are hoping everybody in the ecosystem are using the same term, so it will make it easier for the communication. So sure, I don't think this is a must for everyone or for every project. Sure, but for Kamada, I think Kamada was developed from the SIG multicluster. Kamada will love to follow the standard concept from the SIG multicluster.
Yeah, I can understand that. And yeah, and as your survey pointed out, while people in Karmada are attached to the host cluster term, it's also not a disaster if the documentation is changed. And I should hope that would be the case for other projects as well.
And maybe the solution here is just to keep a list of which project uses what and what this means in the context. Because I'm conscious too, is like implementation like names dictates implementation details. Like a hub cluster immediately goes to networking. Oh, it's a hub, potential hub and spoke. Like host cluster too is like, and realistically speaking, I don't think we will be able to agree on some one name everybody gonna use it. So maybe if we end up with like a glossary document saying like these are terms and these are this is what this means in a Karmada community, this is what it means in a controller runtime community, etc., 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 and like where we connect. I think that would be fine too. Yeah. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and that's already the case in the document. It says, well, in the context at least, it lists a few projects with a name. And that context and the variety is used as a justification to have something where everybody agrees on, have a documentation that says, here's how SIG MC understands things.
And if to go a bit deeper, like having the same name will not mean we're gonna have the same implementations.
No.
Meaning that kind hub cluster, and like what I'm afraid of, that we end up with a 5 kind hub cluster or something in a different project, which has a different spec and different implementations. And now we're basically opening a different can of worms where somebody wanting to support many types of providers end up with this very strange behavior where you're like getting hub cluster and it's confusing from which provider, which group it's coming from. So sometimes having a diverse type of names, as long as we are clear, is kind of advantage in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. And so I guess thinking, for example, of writing multi-cluster runtime providers, your variable names would be a bit weird in the provider-specific code if you were trying to map everything to, well, use the same terminology everywhere. And there'd be a layer somewhere where you'd go from the SIG MC terminology to the provider terminology, and there's room for both, and it would be easier to read the provider if it uses the provider terminology.
Right. It's like, this is one even worse when you start like replicating objects from like, let's say you have a generic control plane, like a kindless API, and now you want to feed all the other APIs into one, and like get hub cluster, and you get 5 of them from different groups. And it's like, do we same or do we different? So yeah, it's what I'm saying, I think, is even if we agree on the same names, we might unintentionally open can of worms down the line.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So what? Maybe to draw this to a close. I'll write down my thoughts on 8210 and, well, the ambiguity around both the host cluster and hub cluster terminologies and my concerns there in 8210. Honkai, you can bring it back up with Cornton as well. And I'll also point out that there are 2 aspects to this. One is the set of musts and shoulds and so on, which I think we all agree on, and the connection to cluster profile. And so maybe we could say that the PR could be merged without agreement on the term, while saying that the exact term is still TBD, but just the concepts, which I think are reasonably clear.
So sorry, you.
Well, what I'm saying is that I think the impression I get is that the difficulty, at least you have with or the Karmada community in general, with the PR as it currently stands, isn't with the concepts that are being defined or the requirements that are placed on the host cluster, all the musts and shoulds and so on in the definition section. It's just with the choice of terms. Is that right?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understand. Do you mean the current PR if we are ready to merge?
Well, so I'm saying well, it seems to me that the most important aspect of the PR is the definition of the term rather than the choice of the term. So it's not that's it's not whether this should be called hub cluster or host cluster or something else. It's what that means. So all the section where it says it is a Kubernetes cluster that acts as a control plane, etc. It must have the control profiles written on it. It may have access to the API metrics or workloads. It may have administrative privileges, and so on. I think that's the key where we're saying that there's a cluster of this type that has the cluster profile and so on. That's the important part. Well, I think there's that side of things to consider, and I think there's agreement in the community that that's accurate or not.
I think for this PR, I talked to Quentin, and I said sorry for block this PR, and he didn't mind to take it slow, and so in my opinion, I would like to run a formal survey, and
Yeah.
I think I can cooperate with Quentin and everyone who want to help. I think it would be great, and I can have to make a schedule on when the schedule started and ended, and the result announced, so something like that. So we can have a clear schedule for this. So basically, for this PR, I don't think we should do it rush.
Okay. Right, that makes sense to me then. So what I've written down in the agenda notes, the notes document is next steps. Run a formal survey. Honkai will raise this with Quarantin. Is that fair enough?
Okay, since we don't have any other topics.
Yep. And MJ, it's actually they're owls, not cats. But yeah, lots of people comment on it.
It helps to identify when the video stream froze.
Exactly, it's my keep alive.
This is she eyes actually moving, or it's like the AI generated?
No, it's the eyes on the clock actually moving. All right. Well, thank you everybody for the discussion. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks' time on this call, and some of you on the US friendly call on Tuesday. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.
Right.